Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the show Astra Taylor, writer, documentarian, co-founder of the Debt Collective, and Leah Hunt-Hendrix, co-founder of Way to Win and the philanthropy network Solidaire, authors of Solidarity, the Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea. Thanks to you both for joining us. Astra, we've spoken to you many, many times in the context of debt, broadly speaking, particularly student debt. Start with why a book about solidarity?
Solidarity is so important. I mean, this is, I think, what y'all are often talking about on this show. It's what every organizer is trying to build. It's a sense of group cohesion, the sense that our fates are interlinked. I mean, it's the majority report. We're trying to build that majority, help it come into being. And so this book is really the fruit of, our collaboration, Leah and my collaboration, and really the product of our time in the trenches. We met at Occupy Wall Street. I went on to help found the Debt Collective. As you mentioned, I've been on the show many times, which is a union of debtors that's been fighting for economic justice. Leah organizes with donors, trying to move donors to support radical change. And what we have to do over and over again is build relationships, try to build solidarity. One of our main points is solidarity doesn't just exist. You really have to nurture it and cultivate it. And it just doesn't get the attention that it deserves. We think that solidarity is as important to democracy as freedom, as equality, as justice, but it's been kind of left out of the pantheon of important concepts. We think it needs to be put right back in there, and that solidarity is actually kind of a precondition of democracy. We're actually not going to be able to build the majority we need, the multiracial, multi-generational, multi-geographic majority we need. We're not going to be able to change the political system if we don't start taking solidarity really seriously.
Leah, let me ask you, I mean, as you both were down at Zuccotti Park, and in fact, this show, we were down there, I think the first live broadcast we may have done, or we had a contraption that we were walking around with at the time. But what I'm curious, out of that experience, what led you into, and you write about, you come from a very wealthy family, and the idea that when you came out of that experience, how did that impact your trajectory to where we get to this notion of realizing like there's a solidarity deficit or debt we can talk about as well?
Yeah. Well, I had always been interested in and deeply troubled by wealth inequality. Partly from recognizing just the fact that it doesn't work for anyone. Even the people in the 1% are struggling with isolation, fear, status anxiety, how to protect how to get to the higher echelons of the 0.1%. So we just live in this society of like real scarcity mentality and competition, and so I was always interested in how we kind of upend the severe wealth inequality that we have. So I was working on my dissertation, my doctorate, when Occupy started, and I was already writing about social movements when I went down to Occupy, but that was the real catalyst for me to actually get involved. And one of the things that really stood out to me during Occupy was the construction of the identity of the 99% as a grouping versus the 1%, which when you think about it, that's like the biggest kind of, it's a very open, welcome, like 99% of us have a lot in common. And we just have to challenge the 1% that's kind of dividing us and keeping us apart and profiting off of that. And even as someone in the 1%, I feel like you can be in solidarity with the mission of equality and justice for everyone. And so, yeah, we just realized that there wasn't, like, this book should have already existed. There was nowhere to go to really think about, like, people would throw around the concept of solidarity, sign their emails with it. but there wasn't really deep discussion of what does it actually mean? How do you actually build it? And it's really hard and it's complicated. And that's why we ended up with a very dense book. But we hope we start to do it justice, and that others will continue to help thinking about it and kind of building on the project.
And I should say, I mean, the book outlines moments in history of examples, almost like case studies, if you will, of solidarity and how it builds and whatnot. And so, Astra, let's start with that concept of solidarity debt before we go into the different types of solidarity. What is solidarity debt?
This is how Leah convinced me to write this book with her. And we were talking on the phone, strategizing, scheming, as we often do. And she said, Astra, I've been meaning to tell you that in my, research, writing this dissertation of the sort of history of this idea, I found out that the word solidarity and the original concept, as it was sort of brought into Western political thought and the sort of history that brought it to us today. In the beginning, it was actually a concept in ancient Roman law, and it meant a debt held in common. Obligato in solidum. So a debt held in common. So picture multiple farmers on the hook together. And so if someone's sinking, people have to step up and bail each other out. And so, of course, I'm interested in debt. So that kind of caught my imagination. But what it also did was it showed right there that solidarity is a material concept. It's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling or an affect like I got you or I feel your pain, empathy, pity. Solidarity is material. And that idea that we're all actually indebted, we're all on the hook together, then actually was incorporated into political thought. In France, we trace this lineage and theorists during the Industrial Revolution started to think about what would hold society together in this period of tumult, right? Again, capitalism is coming into being, modern democracy as we know it. And people were asking, well, what's going to hold society together? And people started theorizing about solidarity. And solidarity, of course, became a kind of rallying cry of the labor movement. But we really pick up on this idea that solidarity is about our interdependence. It's a relational concept. Solidarity is bonds between people. And this idea that we're all indebted, in France in the early 1900s actually becomes one of the bases of the French welfare state. This idea that we have to sort of, pay our debts forward by investing in social provision that helps care for future generations and people who have less privilege. So there's this rich intellectual history that was news to me, right? Again, because it's just a word we throw around, and then it's also a practice. It's also a practice, and that's why we have those stories of history that you mentioned, the stories from the past of movements that actually built new identities, found effective strategies, and really moved the needle, against really tough odds.
And Leah, that's one of the things that you guys write about, that concept, which you touched on to a certain extent in terms of like wealth inequality being bad also for the 1%. But this idea of there being a material basis to solidarity, and that those engaging with it in that dynamic of solidarity all have a material reason to do so. Will you expand on that? The idea that it's not about empathy necessarily, although, that helps, but it's also about self-interest that is that creates that solidarity.
Yeah, we think it's important to have a sense of how we are all really literally in this together and bound together, and so there is a self-interest in making sure that everyone is surviving and doing okay. And so we talk about the semblances of solidarity, like empathy, charity, benevolence, altruism. There was a movement recently in philanthropy called effective altruism, which has motivated a lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley. Sam Bankman-Fried was one of the kind of leading figures, or most infamous. And the idea of altruism, it it asks you to kind of do for others, but it's still really about your own moral purity, and it's a little bit out of touch with the material ways that we're all interconnected. So even as I work with philanthropists and donors, I think it's important for them to see that they would benefit from a stronger labor movement. They benefit, white people benefit from racial justice policies. We all benefit from a world that has more public goods, more safe, it's safer for everyone. And so acting from that place of actually enlightened self-interest leads to actually potentially better outcomes.
Astra, how do you take that? I mean, so, and I get the idea that it's not, this isn't just about me feeling good or being able to, go to a party and say, look what I've done for people, and that type of sort of self-interest.
That's philanthropy.
But, well, I mean, and we'll get into
We'll
that
get into
because
that,
this is there's stuff that I had no idea about, these philanthropy funds that go back and forth is sort of fascinating to me. But we're going to get there. But how, from a philosophical standpoint, Astra, do you delineate between the idea that solidarity is in that the true solidarity is in the best material interest of everyone engaging in that dynamic, versus the sort of libertarian notion of if everybody acts in their own self-interest, we get the best outcomes from society. What's the difference there, right? How do you where is it that the group's interest align in a way that acting in your own self-interest doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, as the granddaughter of an avid Ayn Randian libertarian, I'll say that the self-interest that many libertarians espouse is purely economic, right? I mean, the idea is that if you pursue your material self-interest in terms of capitalists thriving and success, so trying to make money, trying to advance yourself in the terms set by the market, then that will magically lift all boats, that will create the most wealth. So, I mean, our sense of the kind of self-interest we're advocating for is much more expansive, right? I mean, as Leah was saying, white supremacy is not good for white people. And there are sort of economic arguments to be made for that, right? I mean, when we eviscerate public goods, a whole lot of white people also suffer from the lack of those. When we fail to, engage in, climate forward policies, we all suffer as a result of that. So I think we are arguing for a much more expansive conception of self-interest, and it's something that I think this insight really does come from our time, again, as organizers, organizing with the data group to hang together is by saying, there's something in it for you, right? And, at the Debt Collective, we're fighting both for the cancellation of people's individual debts, but people also fight for each other. And there's also a benefit of, there's that benefit of feeling that you have camaraderie, that you're in community, that you have agency. And so self-interest to us, I think, is, it's a much more expansive thing. It's not just what's in your bank account. And it's not a competitive zero-sum version of self-interest.
Right. That zero-sum seems to me to be the fundamental difference, right? Because it's not exclusively in your self-interest, because within the context of our system, exclusively in your self-interest would necessarily mean that it is not in the best interest of at least a significant portion of people around you, right? I mean, you can't become that rich. Everybody can't become that rich, because it's about a dynamic that is going on where you have that wealth inequality, that's the definition of rich. If we all have $1 billion, then you're not necessarily working in your self-interest if you want to be able to get something that somebody else can't. You're not going to be able to buy your first sink or whatever it is that we want to get at any given point.
Elon Musk would probably disagree with us, right? But we our position is it would be better for him. He'd be a healthier man if he wasn't a billionaire. But so we don't think that we can persuade everybody to come to this more enlightened perspective. We understand that there's a fight, which is why there's a lot of emphasis on building power and strategy in this book. But nevertheless, we do think that the zero-sum game really isn't good for anybody.
Leah, delineate for us the difference between transformative and reactionary solidarity.
Yeah, sure. Well, solidarity in general is not always good. Solidarity is sort of a neutral concept that just means like group cohesion, how groups come together and create a shared identity. And so this can go in a lot of different directions. So we wanted to really distinguish sort of the positive and the negative formulations of this. So we call reactionary solidarity is when a group comes together sort of based on a strict division between us and them they are to be annihilated. They are a threat to our existence. And it is back to this kind of zero-sum mentality. So, and white supremacy, patriarchy, even nationalism, we see a lot of instances of, and ruling class solidarity which is very strong. These are all examples of reactionary solidarity. Transformative solidarity is when you try to build bridges across divides. It's less about sort of given identities, though we actually don't think any identity is really given, but sort of prefabricated identities to build bigger collectivities that are more diverse and more inclusive. And it's structurally different from reactionary solidarity because the line between us and there still is a them, but the line between the us and them is malleable, it's porous. The them is not to be annihilated, but is potentially to be transformed. So the ends of transformative solidarity are like more inclusion, and we like actually hope that the them, the they, whoever we're polarized against, actually benefit from the changes that we're trying to pursue. So again, like we want Elon Musk to be happy, and we think that a world where with high taxation and a more equal wealth distribution would actually help that. So we're not trying. So transformative solidarity doesn't try to annihilate its other, but it does still involve polarization.
Astra, let's go into. I mean, I should also just say, like, conceptually, I get it. I don't care about Elon Musk, but conceptually, I get that. But so Saul Alinsky, you quote Saul Alinsky in the book, saying something to the effect of like, "Friends aren't permanent, neither are our enemies." In practice, like that idea that the expansive solidarity, or I should say transformative solidarity, is expansive. How do you make those? I mean, I understand the difference too in terms of like the them in that instance. We're not looking for them to suffer. We believe that for them, it's also going to be better. Now, you can clearly see the distinction between white supremacy and a notion of like, an all inclusive type of a notion of like when the solution arrives, right? Like white supremacy, the end game is to have whites supreme and others sort of suffer on some level. In the opposite, even if those white supremacists aren't part of the coalition, the solution benefits them because we're living in a more just society, and we're able to sort of get more like universal services, for instance, because race, just in this instance, is not used as a cudgel. How do you, each time that it's divided 99% in them or whatever it is, how are those lines drawn? And particularly in a situation where it's like, we're not talking about 99% of the people, for instance, like trans rights, right? Like we're actually talking about, I don't know, I mean, 1%, 2%, the rights of those people. How do you delineate where the us and them is in those instances with the understanding that at different times it's fluid?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question and something that we try to answer in the book over the course of 400 pages. But I think, one thing we're very attentive to is the way that the right wing uses reactionary solidarity to divide and conquer, right? And so that is, a sort of key part of the book. Solidarity for us is not spontaneous, whether it's reactionary or transformative. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes resources. And a whole lot of resources have been put into, as you said, using race as a cudgel, taking real issues like trans people's lives and using it as a wedge. I mean, we're seeing this right now, I think, around the movement for Palestine, and, is using this as a wedge issue to divide liberals, divide the left. And so, the Sal Lindsay quote, "No permanent friends, no permanent enemies." This is the idea why we settled on the word transformative. It's the idea that people and systems can change. Nothing is set in stone. The identities we use today, those have been formed over generations. The political system is an invention of human beings. These things can be changed. Now, to do that work, we have to be really strategic. And I do think there's always going to be polarization, but we do have to be careful because as we choose our enemies, we remake ourselves. So it's a high stakes process. I mean, I'll say just, in the debt collective, for example, we're fighting for the abolition of unjust debts, and for the provision of free public college, universal healthcare, so that people do not have to take on life-destroying debts to survive. So our target is the economic system that allows people a class of people to profit from poverty. So, we are polarized against creditors and privatizers and profiteers. So when if we manage to change the system, right, and let's say we win universal healthcare so people don't have to take on medical debt, well, those people then can't occupy that position in the economy, right? And so that frame allows us to then unite people who might otherwise be divided, right? To unite debtors across race, across geography, across age, against this structural enemy, against their shared oppression. And so I think each move, we go through the history of different movements, and this is, what movements have to do. This is why we say there does have to be some polarization. There does have to be an us and a them, but we want it to be one that has the capacity to, build a majority, bring people into a new kind of community, to bridge across identity divides, and hopefully find a strategic lever so they can actually change things and make their lives better, and set the next generation up for a more interesting fight.
And the idea is that everybody theoretically shares in the spoils, that
Yes.
being not necessarily, cash, but a better society,
Yes.
one that is going to be more functioning for everybody.
Yes.
Leah, speaking of spoils, let's talk about the philanthropy thing. I had mentioned to you guys beforehand, I was excited to see Emil Durkheim, somebody I hadn't thought about in many, many years. I have thought a lot about that Rand Corporation report on the Gates Foundation or the Gates initiative in education. We used to do a lot more with education, talking about the corporate reform stuff, in the past on this program. And it was a story that really got no play. But just to sum it up, the about 15 years after or 10 years after Gates at the least sunk about $1 billion into our education system with an experiment, which fundamentally altered the trajectory of education in this country for, I would argue, at least a decade or two in terms of like where it continues, and value added on testing and whatnot. The Rand Corporation did an assessment that the Gates people hired and said, yeah, no, didn't work. You should listen to teachers next time, essentially, which is what the teachers in the education have been saying. Got very little play, but it showed the real danger in having people have that kind of wealth where it's like, I have an idea about this. I think I'm going to do it. And I don't have to include the people I didn't want to include in there. But this world of philanthropy, talk about that to a certain extent, and also tell us: is it the DAFs, the funds, DAFs,
Donor advised funds? Yeah,
I had no idea about this. It's just a full-on scam, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to remember that this whole system we live in of philanthropy, nonprofits, political organizations, all of this is constructed by policy and tax law, basically. And so early in the 1900s, Rockefeller and other kind of millionaires, billionaires wanted to create a system that would house their wealth and protect it from taxation. And to do that, they would have to give away a small portion of it. So in general, foundations have to give away 5% of their corpus a year. And actually many don't even do that. And the rest can sit in the stock market and be invested and grow. And so it really, the whole structure is a tax shelter, and that really benefits the wealthy. And then meanwhile, the money that they are giving to nonprofits is not used it's they get to decide where that goes. In general, the majority actually goes to religious institutions and maybe the arts and hospitals, private institutions. Very little gets spent on social justice or climate and other kind of progressive causes. But even the money that does is then spent in ways where the donor has kind of undue power over the strategies and tactics that organizations use. So there are many examples of what scholar Megan Francis Ming calls movement capture, where a foundation might redirect. She writes about how the Garland Fund, which was a progressive foundation in the mid 1900s, kind of redirected the NAACP away from working on violence against Black people towards working on education, and just how that shifted the whole racial justice movement at the time. And so it's just a really problematic structure. It's one thing, and yeah, DAFs are even worse. Foundations at least have to disclose what they give to. They're supposed to show that they're giving away 5% a year. DAFs don't even need to do that. So it's kind of all dark money.
But explain that dynamic about the DAFs where they can actually contribute to each other and it being considered a contribution to charity. But in fact, these are just, as far as I can tell, stock portfolios that you're giving to a charity, and this charity's job is to build more money. And that's what we do with the money that we get. And it almost sounds like it's just traded back and forth. What happens with those profits? Like, do they go back into the fund or can they be redistributed back to the donors?
No, I think that in general, they do stay in the fund, but it doesn't really matter that much because the donors still can.
Do the donors get tax credit for the increase in the value of those funds?
They're not taxed on the increased value of those funds. Yeah.
But do they get a tax benefit? Like, is it a right? Like, if I put $500,000 into a fund, one of these DAFs, and it turns into 10 years later $1 million, can I write off that extra $500,000?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a tax benefit machine that they've built. That's it. It's just a way of getting tax breaks.
Yeah. So, tax law is really important and it's really wonky and not a lot of people pay attention to it. There are groups like Patriotic Millionaires is a project out of DC that tries to organize millionaires to work on higher taxation, on progressive taxation. They lobby Congress, but not a lot of people work on it. Besides that group, almost nobody is no wealthy person is funding work on progressive taxation. And this is going to be a really big issue in the next election cycle because the Trump tax cuts are going to expire. And it's really important to be, even if Biden wins, it's going to be important to be ready to fight to increase taxation on the wealthy.
Astra, let's talk a little bit about the idea of a solidarity state and sort of the challenges that we're facing at this moment to both, Well, let's talk about the solidarity state, and then I want to talk about just sort of like assessing where we are on the left, because I think you outlined three sort of challenges that face us now. One, sort of the late stage capitalism, the neoliberalism, and Trump, just in terms of the authoritarianism, and it's going on around the world, but also the left, to the extent that we have one in this country, is about as fractured and on its I think so, like, heels in a way that it really hasn't been since this era of like post Occupy.
Yeah. Okay, so to begin with the solidarity state. I mean,
Sorry, that was a big question.
Yeah, there's a lot there, and I really felt it. I mean, so we talk about solidarity at multiple levels. So one, solidarity is something that you build in your interpersonal relationships, right? I mean, you can act in solidarity with movements on your own to a degree. We also talk about it at the level of, institutions like unions and be they labor unions, tenant unions, debtors unions, other community groups. But we also think solidarity is something that can be implemented at the level of policy. So in this sense, solidarity is a means and an end. So it is the means by which ordinary people build power together, but it's also the end goal. We want to create a more solidaristic society. As a backdrop to this, so that it sounds less, utopian, I think it's important to recognize how anti-solidarity policies are built into the law as it currently exists, right? Like, we live in a society, capitalism is very anti-solidarity. It encourages competition, the accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of a few. It creates, a culture of zero-sum kind of scarcity. And of course, the tax regime that we're talking about, right, is one that doesn't exactly foster solidarity. But you can also see it, very much in labor law. For example, in the United States, we have very regressive labor laws. Solidarity, or what are sometimes called sympathy strikes, are illegal, which means that if there is a strike at Amazon, for example, UPS workers or FedEx workers or postal workers cannot strike in solidarity as they can in other countries. And we're seeing the criminalization of protests right now. This is part of why it's a tough moment for the left, right? We're seeing the criminalization of protests on campus, but also over the last few years, we've seen a lot of laws that are anti-solidarity passed. So, for example, laws targeting abortion providers, or making it illegal, or offering bounties for people who help others get reproductive health care. We're, in Georgia, in response to the Stop Cop City movement, it is now illegal for people to bail out more than 3 folks a year. So that is targeting, bail funds, which are a key form of solidarity. Many states have passed very harsh measures saying, it's a felony to block a sidewalk or an intersection, or maybe it's actually legal, or you are protected if you ram your car into protesters. So law can be used in different ways. It can be used to attack solidarity, or we are saying to foster solidarity. And so a solidarity state is something, we consider it sort of the next step beyond the welfare state. And a solidarity state would not just aim to redistribute wealth. Well, that's really important, right? It's important to have social policies that are more egalitarian, a more progressive tax code, for example, better social services. But a solidarity state would recognize that we also need to be attentive to relationships, to help people feel themselves as and understand themselves as interdependent citizens. So I'll just give an example and wrap up. The way the welfare state works today, what we have of one, is that wealthy, affluent people get all these invisible benefits, like the tax code we're talking about. Yeah, put your money in a DAF, write things off. Or, in a more sort of banal example is, you get a mortgage, you get your mortgage interest deduction. That's a huge subsidy to mostly affluent people. And people don't think of that as welfare. They just get these benefits. If you are working class, you're poor, you're lower income, and you seek benefits from the state, they're stigmatized. There's all sorts of bureaucracy. You're made to feel awful about yourself. And both of those extremes undermine solidarity. One part of the population is stigmatized, made to feel like they're takers. The other side just sees themselves as makers. They get all these invisible benefits, but they don't have to see that they're actually interdependent, right? A solidarity state would bring all of this, equalize that, bring into the open, and be like, actually, we're all products of society. We all benefit from these social programs, and so we are envisioning, a range of policies that would, again, be progressive in an economic sense, but also really try to create what we call solidaristic feedback loops that help us see ourselves as having stakes, as benefiting from public goods. And we think that would go a long way in terms of creating a different kind of consciousness that would make it harder to roll back progressive gains.
Yeah, and I think you cite Susan Mettler and her Submerged State, I guess her book actually, and so the idea is to make the state, the role of the state, less submerged, and both in practice and in perception, as to where we are. I mean, you mentioned also, the student protests, and one of the ways that solidarity was undercut, and Reagan had this idea, in addition to wanting to, provide tax cuts to people, but also saw the benefit of, if we raise tuition on University of California students, the stakes of their protest become a little bit more, a little higher. And like, you're wasting all this money. You're not, talk a little bit, Leah, about that sort of dynamic that exists. I mean, particularly in the context of what we've just seen. But I know also you guys write that student protests are super important, but they only have so much power because they're students, as opposed to economic power in their working. But talk about both those dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, when you think back over the past decades, students have always been at the forefront of peace movements and the climate movement, so many important movements. And it's been interesting how their tactics have evolved from demonstrations to more recently encampments, divestment strategies. They've evolved, I think, as the left has evolved, and even electoral strategies. Many students were involved in the uncommitted movement during the Democratic primaries. And so I think all of this is really important. But as the example you cited, Reagan said, if it becomes too costly to go to school, the more expensive the more it costs to go to school, the less, and the more debt that you're incurring, the harder it is to take that time to protest and express your civil liberties. And so there was a direct correlation between the increase in tuition costs and student debt and the clampdown on the anti-war protests during that period. And so, yeah, I mean, and we've seen, it's just been the backlash, or the clampdown on students over the past months has just been incredible. But I think it's also been really inspiring that young people continue to see the interconnection between issues around war and peace, military budgets, climate justice, racial justice, and that they're, putting their lives on the line and incurring really significant costs for doing that. And I think we think that we should all be supporting them as much as possible.
Astra, lastly, let's just focus in just a little bit more on the sort of like what we're seeing in the left at the moment, and even also considering the sort of like expansive view on that from center to the left, because it feels like we're back into an era where we were 20 years ago, where there was sort of like centrists really making their bones, complaining about the left's tactics or their shrillness or whatnot, in part because there has been in the left, I think since Sanders' campaign ended in 2020, a sort of lack of focus, maybe, or in some respects, or a less of a singularity in terms of, it's not 99% versus one. It's maybe a bunch of different other things, although obviously that those concepts still exist. And in part, because there was some, policy victories, or at least a nod towards them from the Biden administration, more than I think a lot of people thought would be. Like, where are we on that in that area, and how do we get out of it and move into the next sort of era of a more cohesive left in this country?
It's a big question. I mean, this is something we think about all the time. Yeah, I mean, it's something we think about and wrestle with all the time. I mean, I think we wrote this book because actually we really think solidarity is the key. I think the left would be on stronger footing if we had a strong recognition of the importance of solidarity as the way by which we build a bigger movement, so that we have power to win more. And that means, building coalitions, working with people who aren't 100% on the same page as you, but always trying to bring more people in the door. I mean, it is a tough moment where we are in a moment of backlash, which is a word I don't really love, because the backlash in the United States is kind of eternal, right? I mean, wherever, there have been movements for multiracial democratic gains, right? There has been pushback, sometimes ferocious, right? If you go back to, the violent suppression, for example, of Reconstruction after the Civil War. I mean, look at backlash after the Civil Rights Movement, right? We actually opened the book with A Tale of the Southern Strategy, which was a conscious, use of racial appeals by Republicans, by advisors to the Nixon campaign, to divide and conquer people and play up people's resentments so that the plutocrats could win. And so, the backlash is there, and we also do have to cast a critical glance at our side and be like, what could we be doing better? How could we be smarter? How could we, again, really prioritize bringing more people into our movement and have a long view? Because we're not going to win in one election cycle. And we are working with an electoral system that is really tough. It's a winner take all two-party system. And, that's the terrain that we're fighting on. And it's one that, allows for massive injections of dark money. And so this is the terrain we're on. It's not fun. But we're only going to move the needle, I think, if we are, really, if we stay on mission, if we're really dogged. And I think we have to be alert to these divide and conquer tactics, and right now, I think there are both, there's the far right, attacking woke, right, and trying to turn woke into a slur and sort of put the, put liberals and the left on the back foot, and to appeal to people's grievances and resentments and talk in this faux populist way. So we have to be aware of that. But as you said, I think there are also a lot of, liberals who are also seizing on this moment to attack the left. And ultimately, they're, assisting an authoritarian project by doing so, right? I mean, when Hillary Clinton comes out and endorses George Latimer against Jamal Bowman, this moment, it's like you're enabling authoritarianism. So we've got to fight on a lot of fronts. It's a tough time, but I do think the left is in a better place than 20 years ago. It's not where we want to be, right. But I was there too in the post 9/11 era, and I think there's more class consciousness. I think we have a bigger strategic toolkit, but let's not lose sight of the bigger goal, which is to build big, inclusive, powerful movements, and it takes work. And really, this is why the message of the book is organize, 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 build solidarity. It is the only thing that can save us, because we're not going to be able to outspend these guys. We're definitely not going to outgun them.
I think we could spend an hour on trying to assess Hillary Clinton's endorsement of Latimer, of a guy who has already come out and said, I'm not even going to support Joe Biden's returning, raising taxes on millionaires. I mean, it's pretty stunning, the lengths that they'll go to just to prevent one progressive voice in Congress in that instance. But that will have to wait for another day. The book is Solidarity, the Past, Present, and Future. And we will put a link to that at of a world-changing idea. We'll put a link to that in our YouTube and podcast descriptions and at majority.fm. Astra Taylor, Leah Hunt-Hendrix, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Good to see you all.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.